And welcome back. I think I know a couple of you in here, but for those who I haven't met before, my name is Michael Schleiffer. I've been on the board of the Thoreau Society for a long time. This afternoon's topic, our panel is Emerson and the American Renaissance. Right, we have two wonderful speakers who have been with us before. We had a third speaker, unfortunately, will not be attending today, and we'll fill in the time appropriately. First up is someone we've only met here, but many, many times over the years. She's usually traveled the greatest distance, but not even on this panel. I'm referring to Albena Bakratcheva. Yes, I got it. Excellent. Albena is a professor of American literature at New Bulgarian University in Sofia, Bulgaria. And her talk is, and I'm still trying to figure out what it's about, but I guess we're going to find out now. The Nonprosaic Mood, Configurations of Quixotic Insanity in the American Renaissance. Albena?
Ah, okay, thank you. Thank you so much. Hi. Some recent circumstances in my life led me to the rereading of Cervantes's Don Quixote, and along with that, to the rereading of Miguel de Unamuno on Don Quixote, of Ortega y Gasset on Don Quixote, etc., etc., etc. And of course, I would never stop reading my favorite authors. So that's what I came up with. To every brain, a several vein of madness from the gods, Ralph Waldo Emerson wishfully exclaimed in a poem tellingly called The Skeptic. Yet he knew that the madness he was referring to was not for every brain, and his essay Heroism made it clear that, I quote, the heroic cannot be the common, nor the common the heroic. And the heroic consisted for Emerson with a rare or uncommon, God-blessed madness. His younger fellow Concordian Henry David Thoreau echoed in Cape Cod, I quote, nothing remarkable was ever accomplished in a prosaic mood. Refer to the world standard, the heroes and the discoverers are always insane, unquote. Emerson encouraged Bronson Alcott, William Ellery Channing, Henry Thoreau, Jones Very, and Margaret Fuller to be uncompromisingly high-minded in accordance with his view of the literary vocation, which in fact remained quite nebulous and extravagant, and so kept them all from literary success, at least as the common measures it. I will focus here on the severe incompatibility between the Emersonian godly madness and the lack of institutional outlet for it in the time of the American Renaissance. Dealing with the romantic understanding of Miguel de Cervantes's Don Quixote as a book about the ever-elevating relevance of literature and uncompromising high-mindedness to everyday living, I will outline the anomalous position of the transcendentalist literati in the terms of a New England insane, quixotic quest for perfection, both of the individual and the world. Moreover, the unique sense of place of Emerson's transcendentalists will be approached as providing a specifically New England tinted and at the same time transnationally, translocally relevant perspective towards certain literary traditions and their cultural contexts. We are the club of the like-minded. James Freeman Clarke famously dubbed the transcendentalist group in order to explain, because no two of us think alike. The pun was good enough and moreover truthful. What lied behind it was Emerson's demand for nonconformism or inveterate self-trust. Whoso would be a man must be a nonconformist, Emerson insisted. Absolve you to yourself and you shall have the suffrage of the world. Emerson's appeal, quixotic as it was in its idealism and inapplicability to real life, turned out to be extremely attractive to most Concord's intellectuals of the time. It pleasingly provoked all kinds of different and even contradictory responses, but always coming forth in the form of utmost respect for the uniqueness of individual thinking and behavior. However, it also reflected all the complexity of Emerson's steadfastness and bore the practical, or rather all the impractical consequences with regard to actual life experience. In fact, Emerson's preference for the message over the practice of his teaching was a pleasingly deliberate quixotic choice. The ideal shall be real to thee, Emerson inspiringly announced the poet's greatest reward to be. The consequences of such a choice in the sanity of the real world were only predictable, hence the title of the above quoted poem, The Skeptic. Thus, within the reason-madness nexus, which, as Michel Foucault argues, I quote, constitutes for Western culture one of the dimensions of its originality, unquote, Emerson's romantic vision featured the New England interpretation of the godly, extra-worldly, insane powers of the creative imagination. And Thoreau celebrated the non-prosaic mood. When Emerson wrote at midlife with deep satisfaction that after writing and speaking for 25 or 30 years, he had, quote, now not one disciple, he was clearly exaggerating. This was theory for theory's own sake. Emerson would never think of self-reliance in any terms of mentorship, as this would sharply contradict his insistent appeal for always acting singly. Still, as Larry Buell rightfully observes, it was Emerson himself who called attention to the teacher-student relation as early as 1837, and ever since the American Scholar oration, it was to remain a central transcendental issue, which in its turn suggests an approach to the most significant intellectual relation in 19th century New England, that between Emerson and the 14-year younger Thoreau. Whether Thoreau was an Emersonian or not was a question very much present in their contemporary Concord already, as the following story nicely demonstrates. One of Thoreau's mother's boarders was holding forth on how Thoreau resembled Emerson. "Oh, yes," said his mother, "Mr. Emerson had been a good deal with my Henry, and it was very natural he should catch his ways." The time of the American Scholar was the time of young Thoreau's self-identification. It was in these youthful years that Emerson's impact was definitely productive for him, as Emerson strongly encouraged his sense of responsibility for his own self. In this same 1837, Thoreau joined the Transcendental Club and made 2 significant steps toward the deliberate creation of his autobiography, changed his name, and started to keep a journal. Emerson had already celebrated man's power to connect his thought with his proper symbol, and Thoreau, the way he would repeatedly do in the course of the years, transformed his senior co-thinker's impressive abstraction by applying it to his real life and his real person. He reversed his given name, David Henry, in order to establish what he felt the proper correspondence between his self and its symbol name in this world. And so the writer, Henry David Thoreau, was born. This was essentially an act of self-initiation. Young Thoreau was already concentrated on his own self to such an extent that he could not be anyone's follower, not even Emerson's. Moreover, his self-reference was not pseudonymous. Unlike his European contemporaries with their passion for pen names, Thoreau decided on the true name of the writer he intended to be. The gesture was intrinsically Quixotic, in both the absolute seriousness it was made with and the sheer awareness it indicated that choosing a new direction in life requires a proper self-naming. Thoreau began his remarkable, heroic quest for ultimate truths beyond the commonly seen by going for the properly high-minded knight-errant's writerly name. Also, he set about keeping a journal. His first entry began in a dialogue manner, most certainly in response to Emerson, but mentioned no name. This was symbolic to the way things would unfold over the years, as Thoreau's entire journal offers quite vital and immediate image of its author, who would listen to nobody but his own different drummer. Things were much more complicated indeed, and the Emerson-Thoreau relation surely lends itself to be considered as reciprocal, especially in Emerson's eyes. Though their friendship was gradually cooling, Emerson preserved his utmost admiration for his younger fellow Concordian. As for Thoreau, though he never admitted it, Emerson's figure was indispensable. As Laura Walls insightfully observes in her recent biography of Thoreau, his, I quote, lifelong dialogue with Emerson, by turns loving, inspired, hostile, angry, and reconciled, would turn Thoreau into a great and wholly original writer. Thoreau's creativity was realized not alone, but in partnership, as Emerson fanned his creativity into genius, unquote. No critical thinking on Emerson is viable without including Thoreau, and the reverse is just as true. Complex as it was, the reciprocal Emerson-Thoreau relation certainly provokes an allusion to the long line of inseparable duos in literary history and to the perhaps most legendary of them all. The dynamics of the relation inside Cervantes's duo, or the sanctification of Don Quixote and the quixotization of Sancho, suggests approaching the complicating interconnection between the two concordians from the perspective of the meandering correlations their minds were making over the years between illusion and reality, the wish to be seen and the actually seen, the ideal and the real, the abstract and the concrete, the general and the specific, the Kantian noumena and phenomena. Such a perspective clearly brings into focus the inseparability of Concord's literary duo, the sage, the inspired and inspiring spiritual leader, the public speaker, who gained transnational recognition in his lifetime already, and the seemingly local writer, transcendentalist, mystic, and natural philosopher to boot, whose ecocentric thinking would open up the whole global vista of future environmentalism, each man the alter ego of the other. Emerson's vagueness and Thoreau's astute sense of place, Emerson's nationalist cosmopolitanism and Thoreau's cosmopolitan nationalism, Emerson's transnationalism and Thoreau's translocalism, the uncompromising high-mindedness, the godly insanity of the two remarkable New Englanders, which put them together in the eyes of the commons as manifest eccentrics. All of this brings in another important issue as well, namely the reality of the transcendentalists' own lives in the terms of their professional unfulfillment. Directly related to their Puritan New England roots, Emerson's co-thinkers saw the greatness of art only as commensurate to its spiritual and moral truth. They were aesthetes and men of spirit, wanderers among the vague, barely distinguishable shapes of beauty and of faith, who did not merely claim that every great artist had to be by definition a good man, but went even further, stating the reverse to be true, or that a good man made a great artist. They could accept the messianic character of Emerson's poet priest with nothing less than seriousness, and so the image was turned into a desired model for life. Gazing steadily into the ideal, the like-minded Emersonians began to see their own lives within the absolute aesthetic religious formula, and thus, to differing degrees, for better or for worse, try to shape their own lives according to the precepts of an idea. The poet priest was not simply a role to play, but more than anything, the naming for the inner makeup of a character. And such deliberate self-identification inevitably required a real life career. However, finding such a career proved difficult, as Massachusetts in the first half of the 19th century provided no real conditions for professional fulfillment. The church pulpit was no longer sufficient, but profoundly Puritan New England had no other institutional option to offer. So in their positive desire to identify themselves fully with the ideal, the transcendentalists had to confront the lack of any institutional opportunities for realizing their ambitions. Emerson's public resignation from serving the church acquired symbolic significance for the entire transcendentalist movement, but it also finally rejected the only available vocational choice. As a result, the transcendentalists came in contact with real life, with life's material and financial needs, only insofar as they managed to push aside temporarily the ideal of the poet priest and accepted more or less institutionally required roles. such as that of the priest, the person of independent means, the teacher, the journalist, etc. All of these were accidental roles which received positive social sanction but had nothing to do with the transcendentalist's poetic religious calling. The inevitable confusion all Emerson's young men suffered resulted in, as Sherman Paul put it, in a series of personal failures. In fact, the series of the transcendentalist personal failures was the effect of a severe discrepancy between ideal and reality. And yet this discrepancy was actively desired and searched for, as the very status of the poet-priest, the missionary, the prophet, the new Messiah reposed in fact on it. Thus, the Emersonian transcendentalist crisis of identity was to a great extent predetermined by their choice to become spiritual leaders whose poetic or holy mission was to improve a dissatisfying world. And such a choice definitely implied pursuing an unconventional, non-prosaic, as Thoreau called it, uncommon path. Moreover, its very impossibility in real life provided even an additional ground for the transcendentalists' pleasing self-awareness as non-compromising followers of a noble, insane vocation. All of this placed the Emersonian literati in what Lawrence Buell called a doubly anomalous position in relation to their time. Such an extraordinary position may certainly qualify as Quixotic, since it epitomizes the rivalry between the real world and the representation we make of it ourselves, or in Harry Levin's terms, the Quixotic principle, and inevitably leads to the Quixotic confusion, or the propensity to confuse the true with the fabulous. The New England transcendentalists deliberately choose a position which by definition did not belong to what was to them the common prosaic mood of their time. Their choice was the result of representatively romantic discontent with their contemporary reality, and at the same time, in its vigorous Puritan spiritual leadership drive, it was essentially anachronistic. The sophisticated delight of identifying with such a doubly anomalous nonconformist ideal only intensified the need for counterbalancing the prosaic sanity of the real world with a wished-for poetic insanity, or Emerson's madness from the gods. Such madness by romantic identification, as Michel Foucault calls that, pointing out that its features have been fixed once and for all by Cervantes, naturally caused confusion between reality and imagination, and the substitution of the true with the fabulous. Hence, all the metaphorical professions of the like-minded 19th century New Englanders. They stuck to Emerson's admonishment that a little integrity is better than any career at the cost of severe crisis of identity, but still remaining madly and maddeningly confused between true poetic vocation and real-life career was exactly what made them feel exceptional. Eric Tilkovsky observes of Don Quixote that, I quote, "The problem of his madness per se has to do and is ultimately eclipsed by a more complex issue. He's trying to sustain his faith in his illusion once he starts to be confronted by the harsh contingency of reality. This problem, Tsiolkovsky accentuates, is inherent in the Quixotic principle. And so it was in the case of Emerson's transcendentalists. The more impractical their ideal proved to be, the more eagerly they strove to maintain their trust in it. Though peculiarly intensified through the Puritan and Americanness terms in which the 19th century New England intellectuals placed it, this problem was far from being merely a local New England phenomenon. In fact, it was inherent in the overall, distinctively translocal and transnational disposition of all romantics. Not surprisingly, they felt closeness to Cervantes's knight errant, which made them transform him into a profound symbol, that of the universal conflict between the ideal and the real, in Schelling's words, between poetry and prose, in Schlegel's words, between the soul and the body, in Heine's words. Similarly, universalizing was Kierkegaard's understanding of Don Quixote as a kind of bridge character whose poetic fate points toward the actual fate of the Christian witness of truth. Kierkegaard adored Don Quixote's happy madness and was displeased with the ending of Cervantes's novel. What troubles me, he writes, most is not that Don Quixote dies, but that he dies a rational man and so ceases to exist as a contradiction to this world. Kierkegaard's American contemporaries, the American Romantics or the New England Transcendentalists, doubtlessly shared this same profoundly symbolic approach to the hero of the great Spanish novel, because their non-compromising high-mindedness, their poetic insanity or Emersonian madness from the gods never ceased to exist as a contradiction to the overwhelming sanity of this world, the pitiless performance-hating nemesis from Emerson's poem.
Okay, let's start with the virtual. Albena, did anyone catch who said we are the club of the like-minded because no two of us are alike?
Think alike. James Freeman Clark. Yeah.
What prompted Emerson to leave the pulpit when he did? Address that.
In my thinking, being such a non-conformist, he felt the pulpit conformist already. Plus, of course, certain circumstances in his own life that made him question the truthfulness of something he was already kind of feeling institutionalized. So I would say he would be approaching this from both sides. His understanding or his sense of this sacred place being transformed into a stiffened institution already, which he would be always against, and his questioning this institutionalization through his personal tragedy at the time, the loss of his wife. So this, maybe more. How can we know? Yeah.
To spare that was.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And our next speaker, I think, certainly gets the prize for the traveling the greatest distance this year. And she has also spoken at the conference, I believe it was twice previously. Professor Izumi Ogura comes to us from Daito Bunka University, I hope I pronounced that right, in Tokyo, where she's a professor of English in the Department of Political Science and Faculty of Law. She will be speaking about Emerson's changing perspective on the problem of slavery.
I prepared the pamphlet of the manuscript so that I can make myself understood much better. Manuscript has about 10 pages, but I will cut and skip a lot of parts. And I think I can finish in 20 minutes. Okay, let me start. On New Year's Day of 1863, when the Emancipation Proclamation was issued, Ralph Waldo Emerson attended the Jubilee concert at the Boston Music Hall and recited the poem Boston Hymn. In an audience of 3,000 people, 20-year-old Henry James recollected, quote, "the momentousness of the occasion, the vast excited multitude, and the tall, spare figure of Emerson," unquote. He remembered the immense effect with which his beautiful voice pronounced the lines, quote, "pay ransom to the owner and fill the bag to the brim. Who is the owner? The slave is owner and ever was, pay him," unquote. In reviewing James Elliott Cabot's memoir of Ralph Waldo Emerson, in which Cabot portrayed Emerson as being neither an abolitionist nor humanitarian, James rebutted him and showed that Emerson had greatly contributed to the abolition of slavery. Cabot had repainted Emerson's image as a calm philosopher by underestimating his political statements. However, young James was insightful enough to see Emerson's impact on the elimination of slavery. In this paper, I first explore how Emerson moved from moderate anti-slavery views in the 1840s to radical abolitionism in the 1850s. He was acutely aware of the political climate of the time and swayed public opinion by identifying possible means of abolishing slavery. After the Compromise of 1850, he expressed his opinions through lectures such issues as Kansas-Nebraska Act, the Dred Scott decision, and John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry. In the meantime, Emerson examined emancipation from 3 points of view: whether emancipation should be immediate or gradual, whether colonization abroad by freedmen was a realistic way, and most importantly, whether abolition should be compensated, as was employed in the British West Indies in 1834. He referred to the cost of emancipation in the lecture, The Fugitive Slave Law in 1851, and lecture on slavery in 1855. Second, I examined how Emerson became involved in national politics in the 1860s with 2 important lectures, American Civilization and Fortune of the Republic. Emerson's 1862 meeting with Lincoln marked the highlight of his career, and during his stay in Washington, D.C., he delivered the American Civilization address at the Smithsonian Institution, in which he demanded immediate emancipation. Another lecture, Fortune of the Republic, attacked the Northern Copperheads. Examining Emerson's two essays, my paper attempts to show how radical Emerson's position against slavery was at the time he delivered the lecture. Emerson first took up the emancipation of American slaves in his 1844 lecture address on the anniversary of emancipation of Negroes in the British West Indies. In the first part of the lecture, he traces the history of slavery in England. The movement of the abolition in England was based on Somerset versus Stuart, 1772. Lord Mansfield ruled against the Master Stuart, stating that slavery was never permitted in England unless explicitly written by law. Emancipation in 19 British colonies was accompanied by compensation of the amount of 20 million pounds. The slave population was 800,000 and it cost 25 pounds a slave. When Olaudah Equiano was manumitted in 1766, he paid 40 pounds to his master, Robert King. Thus, the amount 25 pounds sounds smaller in the West Indies, but it was an average compensation for men, women, and children of all ages. 20 million pounds equaled 40% of annual revenue of the British Empire and could support 100,000 middle-class families for a year at that time. These facts gave Emerson a sense of context when considering a compensated emancipation later. The Constitution of the United States does not use the word slave. 3 places in the text of the Constitution assume the existence of slaves. Article 1, Section 2 mentions the 3/5 of all other persons. Article 1, Section 9 allows the slave trade up until 1808. And Article 4, Section 2 is called the extradition clause, which mandates the return of runaway slave to the owner. However, it does not specify who is responsible for the extradition or how the slaves are returned. The Fugitive Slave Law of Compromise of 1850 aimed at changing the unclear situation between federal and state governments. It granted power to a federal commission to search for and return slaves to the South by forming a posse comitatus, a group summoned by sheriffs, and made the act of helping and hiding a runaway slave a crime with a fine of $1,000. If the slave owner submitted an affidavit declaration, the runaway slave could be arrested. The slave was denied self-defense, habeas corpus, or trial by jury. Emerson changed his attitude from modest anti-slavery to radical abolition with fugitive slave law. He gave 2 lectures on the fugitive slave law, one in 1851 and the other in 1854. The Fugitive Slave Law 1851 has more aggressive contents. He calls the law Webster's treachery and says that Webster became the head of a slavery party. Toward the end of the lecture, Emerson proposed compensated emancipation and estimated the cost. Quote, "It is said it will cost 1,000 millions of dollars to buy the slaves, which sounds like a fabulous price. But the price was named in good faith. I do not think any amount would be quite unmanageable," unquote. Emerson repeats the compensation by saying, quote, "1,000 millions were cheap," unquote. Emerson took up the issue of compensation again in a lecture on slavery in 1855. This lecture was recovered and published for the first time in Emerson's anti-slavery writings by Gudgeon and Meyerson. The estimated cost went up to $2 billion, and he proposed practical ways to collect donations. Quote, "It is said it will cost 2,000 millions of dollars. The United States shall give every inch of public lands. The states shall give their surplus revenues, their unsold lands. The citizen, his private contribution, will have a chimney tax," unquote. Thus, he proposes every man could contribute a week's work to sweep this accursed mountain of sorrow out of the earth. When we recall that the purchase of Alaska in 1867 cost $7.2 million, we can calculate his estimate of $2 billion as being 266 times greater than the cost of Alaska. He also says that this momentous solution is innocent and explains the significance of buying. A quote, "I say buy, never conceding the right of the planter to own, but that we may acknowledge the calamity of his position and bear a countryman's share in relieving him. And because it is the only practical course and is innocent," unquote. The question is whether the compensation to slave owners is really innocent, free from moral wrong. Compensation accepts the slaveholder's claim over the slave as property and would result in more wealth for those who had profited from slave labor. Emerson, Charles Sumner, and Lincoln thought that slaves are human, not property. Lincoln, in his Cooper Union address in 1860, said that, quote, "No such right of property in man is specifically written in the Constitution. The Constitution is literally silent about any such right. We deny that such a right has any existence in the Constitution, even by implication," unquote. And he said that whenever in the Constitution the slave is alluded to, he is called a person. That is, founding fathers intentionally sought to exclude the idea that there could be property in man. It was in 1855, well before the Civil War, that Emerson made an argument for compensated emancipation. Perhaps his idea of compensation was intended as a way to avoid war. Emerson, moving from isolated self-reliance to useful citizens in society, learned that politics is unavoidably accompanied by compromise. Compensation may be an evil, but is a lesser evil than war. He became aware of his responsibility to do something and devote time and energy to abolishing slavery. He rejected the idea of compensated emancipation once the Civil War started, but his choice was significant in his struggle against slavery. A month after the Trent Affair, which strained the diplomatic relationship between Great Britain and the States, Emerson had the opportunity on February 2nd, 1862, to meet President Lincoln. Quote, "The president impressed me more favorably than I had hoped. A frank, sincere, well-meaning man with a lawyer's habit of mind, good, clear statement of his fact, correct enough, not vulgar, as described," unquote. The day before the meeting with Lincoln, Emerson delivered the lecture, American Civilization. The lecture was later divided into two. The first half deals with the progress of history in general, but however, second half differs completely in tone, attacking slave owners. The latter half created a stir among the audience who enthusiastically appreciated it. At the beginning of the latter half of the lecture, he described slavery as the stealing of men, setting them to work, and the thief sitting idle himself. Emerson's criticism of slave owners was rooted in the understanding that labor was disgraceful and that wealth consisted of eating the fruit of other man's labor. Emerson defines labor as the visible sign of a citizen's power into which he aggregates his strengths, thoughts, and affection. In the poem Boston Hymn, before the line, "Pay ransom to the owner," that James pointed out, Emerson mentions a slave owner's pawn and debt in the 16th stanza. Quote, "But laying hands on another to coin his labor and sweat, he goes in pawn to his victim for eternal years in debt," unquote. He proposes that abolition should be the first goal of the war. If the abolition is placed behind unionism and the fight advances without without affirmative steps, such as the forfeiture of all the privileges, quote, they fight on the same side for slavery, unquote. He also insists that mere victory in battle does not eliminate slavery. If the final goal of abolition is not achieved, the South will revive its power. He shrewdly perceived that the Southerners would come back politely, concealing their naughty intentions, but it is a law after the war. They would eventually seek political power because slavery would again speak, quote, its harsh necessity, unquote. Another important lecture on abolition is Fortune of the Republic, which was repeated in 1863 and 64. Toward the end of his career in 1878, when his creative power had declined, Emerson was asked to deliver the lecture, but he could not draft a coherent manuscript. The lecture was not included in the standard Harvard edition because Cabot, the executor of Emerson's manuscript, said, quote, it was put together by me from various lectures, unquote. Emerson's anti-slavery writings and later lectures restored the original manuscript by gathering newspaper articles and lecture abstracts. In the lecture, he lists a name of 4 Northern Democrats, also known as Copperheads, who were sympathetic with the rebellion. Governor Seymour of New York, ex-president Franklin Pierce, and Ohio Congressman Clement Vallandigham. Vallandigham was arrested by the military commission on May 5, 1863, because he discouraged enlistments and declared disloyal sentiments to weaken the government. Vallandigham was expelled to the South, but returned to Ohio via Canada to attack Lincoln. As the lecture was first delivered on December 1, 1863, Emerson had learned of these politicians and of Vallandigham's arrest and dared to mention their names. Emerson was never ambiguous about the war. He said it was futile to speculate whether the war was avoidable or if both sides are wrong. Northern people are placable and forget and forgive all and rush inconsiderately into the arms of their returning prodigals and would accept any terms. By so doing, they would eventually lose, quote, half the fruit of their valor and their sacrifice of life and treasure, unquote. Emerson's advocacy of abolition was rooted in moral and ethical traditions. However, he went beyond these issues to politics. He was conscious that lecturing on simple higher law principle at lyceums would not help abolish slavery. Some critics says that Emancipation Proclamation was a war measure or military necessity to isolate the Confederacy. It is certainly true that Lincoln prioritized the Union and compromised with slavery. Yet it was abolitionists like Emerson who roused the conscience of the North and set the moral forces in motion. If the proclamation was only a strategy to win the war, the entire endeavor of anti-slavery movement would be meaningless. The very existence of those people led to the abolition of slavery and made the Union was preserving. In Fortune of the Republic, he stated that, quote, the end of all political struggle is to establish morality as the basis of all legislation, unquote. Only when laws embody people's deeply held beliefs can the people obey them. For, quote, covenants are of no use without honest men to keep them, laws of none, but with loyal citizens to obey them, unquote. The war effectively ended on April 9, 1865, when Confederate General Robert Lee surrendered. Hearing of Lincoln's assassination at Ford Theater on April 14, 1865, Emerson extolled the slave president's enormous power of this continent in every hour and called him a heroic figure in the center of a heroic epoch. He strongly condemned the act and described the assassin, John Wilkes Booth, as a cockatorus, a monstrous bird consisting of a two-legged dragon with a cock's head. Quote, "The assassin Booth is a type of man of a large class of Southern people. By the destruction of slavery, we destroy the stove in which cockatorus eggs are hatched," unquote. Several days before Lincoln's death, Emerson wrote of his ideas for post-war reconstruction. Quote, "It is far the best that rebels have been pounded instead of negotiated into a peace. I fear that the high tragic historic justice will be softened and dissipated and toasted away at dinner tables," unquote. He was worried about the lukewarm reception of post-war reconstruction process, stating in his journal on November the 5th, 1865, quote, "But the energy of the nation seems to have expended itself in the war, and every interest is found as sectional and timorous as before," unquote. The death toll of the Civil War was 665,850, which is 2% of the population then and equivalent to 6 million today. Despite the massive loss of life, Emerson celebrated the dawn of a new era in which 4 million slaves were liberated. He wrote in his journal of 1865, quote, "The present war on a prodigiously enlarged scale has cost us how many valuable lives, but it has made many lives valuable that were not so before," unquote. His stance and faith never faltered during the darkest hours of the Civil War. In the meantime, he inspired people as an influential lecturer in Concord, Washington, and throughout the nation. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Ogura. If we have any questions in the audience or are any online?
I don't think I can answer the question though. I will try.
I do.
Yes.
It seems, the very clear delineation that the Fugitive Slave Act is what prompted Emerson's turnaround, or to become more.
Yes, I think that's the point of my paper. Before the Compromise of 1850, Emerson was very ambiguous and lenient and tried to find a solution to abolish slavery. But after fugitive slave law, which is included in the Compromise of 1850, he changed completely to the abolition of slavery. When he uses the word anti-slavery, it's a sort of a soft approach to abolish slavery. But abolition is a very strong movement, not like Garrison, but not that radical. But I think Emerson changed attitude at the turn of 1850. I guess.
Just started. Of the war before the deals with this very subject, the Fugitive Slave Act, and you know, how that precipitated events, among other.
And my point of the paper is the two lectures Emerson delivered during the Civil War. And I analyzed quite in detail American civilization and the fortune of the Republic. And Professor Meyerson analyzed and restored the original manuscript by gathering up newspaper articles and abstracts. And I think his achievement really great. When I read American Civilization, Cabot changed quite a lot of part. And as for Fortune of the Republic, I mentioned 3 politicians, Seymour of New York and Franklin Pierce and Clement Vallandigham. And those names are not mentioned in Edward Emerson's works of Ralph Waldo Emerson. Meyerson recovered those 5 names. I cut 2 others. I can't remember though. So I think Emerson is in his youth, he is very philosophical. I think that's true. I read his Nature, American Scholar, and Divinity School, but he tries to get into society and the problems of abolition when he got old, like say in his 50s and 60s. But the sad thing is that his intellect is gradually declining after the Civil War. So his 2 lectures here is a sort of top of his career. And Emerson was very ambiguous and very philosophical in his youth, very difficult to understand. There's no coherent the development of argument, but when I read his lectures on abolition or his lectures on British West Indies, he's very sort of develops his ideas very clearly, like an historian. Especially his lecture on in 1844 about emancipation of the Negroes in the British West Indies. He made a big research on abolition in England. And I thought that was really
About the economics.
Yes. That's a very good question. The question is that how Emerson changed after the Civil War. As I said earlier, he is a sort of Alzheimer. They forget the things, and he has trouble in speaking. And that's why he had to depend on Cabot. And he designated Cabot as an executor of his manuscript. That is, in his late years, Cabot changed the sentences a lot. So when you read the Emerson's works edited by Edward Emerson, Edward Emerson's works is pretty much the copy of Cabot's edition, Riverside edition. So I don't think we cannot rely on Edward Emerson's works. Yeah.
I want to bring Albena back into this as well. But was this also we talked about the relationship between Thoreau and Emerson being strained at many times during their relationship? Was the response to slavery of Emerson's lukewarm, you will, part of the reason for
It might have had something to do with that, but I don't think that's the answer. this was a whole long process of relationship cooling, because Thoreau would not want to be a disciple, but also Emerson would not want to be a mentor. So they would be sort of misunderstanding each other in this sort of relation, teacher-student one. Though I am absolutely convinced that both of them just needed each other very much, intellectually, emotionally, whatever they said or wrote. There is a note in Thoreau's journal, must be from the late 50s, where he says that this relationship is humiliating. Something like that. Yeah, but
To who?
to him. To him, right. But it was just, I think, momentarily something. And I agree with Laura, the thing that I quoted in my paper, that in this relationship, exactly, Thoreau grew up into the writer he became, after all. That they were just inseparable, unthinkable without each other. And this was the most rewarding intellectual, literary, poetical, if you like, relationship of the American 19th century. The other one that I can think of is that between Hawthorne and Melville, but it's of a different nature still.
Thoreau's practical.
Yeah, right. So my focus here was placing this relationship, the inseparability of the two great men of Concord, in the context of the romantic reading, not any reading, but the romantic reading of Cervantes's Don Quixote, because this is a very specific reading. And there are proofs that Emerson knew Kierkegaard very well. And certainly he knew Kierkegaard's book, actually, on Don Quixote. So this was part of my point here, to look at this anomalous discrepancy between ideal and real in New England then, through the terms of this romantic reading of Don Quixote as the knight errant who had to change his name in order to become from Alonso Quijana, Don Quixote, the knight errant, and all of that. And the whole high-mindedness of the age that was certainly there because of Emerson and Thoreau and all of that. So I want to make sure that it was not any reading, because certainly there are lots of readings of this novel, but it's the romantic reading that I had in mind all the time. And if our topic here is the global Thoreau, there we go, the globalized context like this, specifically global or globalizingly specific, I don't know, but hopefully working. Yeah.
Thank both of our speakers.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. You're great.
Just that if anyone is missing their cell